What's good, my dear language learning master? And welcome to the Language Input Podcast. And in today's interview, I'm gonna have Diane, and she's American, but she's a Chinese teacher in America, Mandarin that is. And she's gonna tell us about her experience living in China, about how she went about learning the language, and also the differences between teaching a language with a different alphabet and much more. So yeah, I really hope you enjoyed this episode, and thanks so much for watching. Let's get right into it. Hi Diane, and
Hi, Alvaro.
welcome to the podcast. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
It's a
Yeah,
pleasure.
thanks for the invitation.
And yeah, as usual, just first of all, just tell us a little bit about yourself, especially when it comes to language learning and teaching and all the things that you do in this field.
Great. I am from, as soon as I start talking, people will know, I am from the US and from the US Midwest, where I grew up just speaking English. I had some exposure to languages in school. I took French through, let's see, 6th grade to 11th grade. And then I decided I didn't like my teacher and I didn't take it as a senior, but partly too, because I thought I was going to take an Asian language in college. I was going to be at Wittenberg University, a plug for my undergraduate school, in Ohio. Okay. And they had a very strong East Asian studies program. And I was interested at the time in Japanese. So when I went there, I started taking Japanese. And then I became interested in Chinese and switched, took 2 years of each of those languages. But a much more typical university program, I would say, even today, this isn't necessarily true in the US, but a lot of programs emphasize more language study and learning about the structure of the language and memorizing words and translation. And so I had a lot of that kind of emphasis. I've lost the Japanese almost completely, although I can pick up Japanese text, and because I read Chinese well now, I can figure out the topic. So at least I know what's going on from written Japanese because they share the same characters used approximately in the same meaning. Okay. And then started Chinese, and that was where things stuck. So I took 2 years in college and then was planning to go live in China at some point, eventually got there and lived in China, in the southwest part of China in Yunnan province for about 4 years altogether. I've also lived a few summers in other cities, major cities in China, and done a little bit of travel. But I feel like my Chinese home is in the southwest, and I miss it today. This is, just to clarify, this is not Chinese. Okay. This is from, I believe, Tajikistan. And it's a photo I took in Boulder, Colorado at a tea house. So there's a sister city partnership. So this is the inside of a tea house that's public. You can walk in and look around. So I just like it for the background. But often at this point, this is when somebody says, oh, and what location is this from? And no, not China anyway. Yeah. So let's see, that was when I was in my 20s that I lived in China. I am older than that now. I'll not specify. And then I met my husband on a few months trip back to the US while I was still kind of long-term living in China. And we were interested in each other and kept in touch when I went back to China, and he came to visit and proposed. And so I came back to the US in 2003 or 2004. And so I've been here since then, started teaching a little bit, just one-on-one or tutoring small group classes, and then found a job at a school in north of Chicago and started teaching kids that were 5th grade through 8th grade, eventually had 4th grade. So this is age approximately 8 or 9 through about 13, 14. Okay. So kind of the end of grammar school at a private school, and developed the whole curriculum there, which was really fun and tiring. Because I think younger kids, the more you have younger kids, the younger they go, the more you're dealing with body management and emotion management as the teacher in the classroom, and the less you can rely on the students to do those things for themselves. Okay. With older students, they start to manage those things or hide those things, and it's sometimes not so good. And then they also, you can do more language stuff directly with the older student that you have. But those young kids have enthusiasm and excitement and honesty. And so they're a really good training ground for being a teacher. Right. I then taught at a high school for 3 years and then began working on a PhD. So I'm in a PhD program full-time now and teach a little bit on the weekends online, like you do.
Okay, cool. And
so
yeah, go ahead.
I was thinking that I think that's kind of the teaching trajectory of my life.
Okay.
At least.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. Like when you started teaching in like north of Chicago, that you said, was it TPRS comprehensible input right away or not?
No, I had interesting experiences myself. I said in university level, it was more of a typical kind of a grammar emphasis, testing you through translation. Yeah, it's a more study of grammar. Here's a grammar pattern. Now practice writing it or saying it. That kind of approach. And after college, I still wanted to continue my Chinese, like developing my Chinese language skills. And I tried a variety of different things. I would say when I was living in China, of course, my language growth took off. I do remember getting to China and meeting people who had lived there for less than half a year. And their Chinese was better than me with 2 years of university study and maintenance for a few years out of college. And so my vocabulary practicing and trying to memorize stuff was, I didn't like it. It was not motivating for me. I know of people who do like that, but it's not going to work for you if it doesn't work for you. So, if you're bored by memorizing vocab, there are other better ways to do it. And everybody, I think, can succeed when they're doing more that's input-based and comprehension-based, where a few people, can do that kind of intensive grammar study, intensive vocab study, and they still make progress. I think their progress is a little skewed compared to natural language development, where you're experiencing the way people really talk by hearing them and reading. Yeah. And so you're getting a more native-like kind of language development when you're exposed to more input. So I eventually heard this. This was not something that occurred to me at all, even though I had some of this kind of experience in being in China, being surrounded by language and being able to understand what people said and respond to the degree that I could and get more back. And so really, when I think about my own real progress, it was based on comprehensible input, but I didn't know to seek that yet in my own attempts to learn.
Right.
So after I came back to the US, I started using some podcasts that a student of mine actually recommended, because I was still on the idea that, well, to get better, I need to have a lot of long lists of words, and I need to have maybe, I found some textbooks that had little short reading passages with 20 new words in it, and I try to work those out. And again, demotivating. Yeah. So I started listening to podcasts, and I started trying to get the really, really hard ones. I was like, I can't even understand the pace to pick out words. And so I started going down to the lower levels of the podcast. It was Chinese Pod, which has changed its format since then. I think it's a little more traditional now. But at the time, they were interesting things on a topic. They would tell you in English, here's the topic this podcast is going to be about. And there were 1 or 2, maybe 3 people, either simulating a conversation among friends or a presentation, or talking about some media thing they'd seen, or explaining a topic culturally, and doing that almost entirely in Chinese. And I started to find that when there were like 4 or 5 words that were new, I could understand it more and more. And my pace of listening got better. And it was exciting and motivating. And I was learning about things instead of just trying to work hard and memorize new vocabulary and try to remember how to use it and then try to use it. Yeah. So the personal experience of that was not all things that I processed, like, hey, when I start teaching, how can I give students more like that? No, it didn't occur to me. I found a textbook to use when I was teaching, and it was okay for kids in the sense that it didn't overwhelm them with a lot of direct grammar instruction, and it didn't do huge lists of vocabulary like some textbooks will really focus on that. You know, they have like 4 grammar points up front. Here, learn this pattern. Now practice it with these 25 new words. And that wasn't the way that textbook did, but there was not enough input. So I started creating things for students because I could see that they couldn't remember things yet. You know, so the wheels could have been turning. I had heard about TPR, total physical response.
Yeah.
You know, so it's like raise your hand slowly, raise your hand quickly. You know, like all those kinds of techniques I had heard about before I moved to China, and I had used them a little bit. But I then heard about TPRS, so teaching proficiency through reading and storytelling, which grew out of TPR originally, but developed very much into its own thing and continues to develop into its own thing, moving past where I do. So I don't necessarily consider myself doing TPRS now, but I have a lot of things in common with some older forms of TPRS. And I first learned about that at a school. Haiyan Lu was a Chinese teacher in Wisconsin, still is. And she hosted a program that got me started. Took me a couple years after that. It's like, it felt magical because the teacher was teaching us Russian. Her name was Katya Palkova, so give her credit. She would write words on a board behind her, and so she'd have transliterated Russian and then English. And so she didn't really speak English as we talked, but we made this cute story about somebody wanting a large cappuccino. And I can hear the word cappuccino in her voice still. You know, that was 2010, I think, or 2009 maybe. And it felt so much like, wow, I was just directly getting language. And I thought, I'm going to go back to my classroom. I'm going to do this with the students. And so I walked in the next day with my favorite class. They were, I think, were they 6th or 7th? They were 7th graders then. And I was kind of doing a little bit more input like stuff with them, but not real systematically, not real smoothly. And I remember going, I'm going to try this thing. And so I walk into the front of the classroom and I think, what did she do? I have no idea how she did that. So, I mean, even though there were words up there and I started doing a little bit of those kinds of things, I really needed more help and guidance. What do I do step by step? How can I make that happen? So it was so engaging, not in a frantic way, not like games are engaging, because I was doing a lot of that. Those were things that my students enjoyed, but I didn't see language growth very much.
Right.
So I wanted to see language growth. I was convinced Chinese is not too hard a language for kids without a heritage language exposure. Like nobody at home speaks Chinese. I was convinced that they can learn Chinese. I just wasn't seeing, you know, how can I do it better? So that was what got me motivated to do it. I also was terrified by, you may know in the US, there's a language teaching organization called ACTFL. ACTFL, ACTFL. They promote the idea that ideally you want to be using the target language in the classroom 90%. They don't say 90% of what? Time, words heard. But
right.
You know, it's a guide. It's a guide. It's meant to be, it's a position statement. It's not a mandate per se. But the idea is to grow your language, you need to be exposed to it as much as possible.
Yeah.
And using it when you can. And so that was terrifying to me as a teacher, because I think maybe I had 25-30% of my class time was in Chinese. A lot of the time was me talking in English, explaining. And so seeing the way that teacher did this with creating this story with us, it was like, wow, okay, I want to do it. So it was a moving target. I kept working towards that and found support with other teachers online, which made the biggest difference.
Yeah. But were you sticking to 25-30% at the beginning because you didn't know better, or because you felt like your Chinese wasn't good enough, or combination of both?
Yeah, I was teaching beginners, and I was pretty confident in my Chinese for that level at that point. So despite, like, I was at the same time I'm talking about this, I was still listening to podcasts, but by then, 3 years in, I was starting to get better. What I would do, and this is a great thing to do if somebody is a language learner and you want to kind of check your own progress, I would listen to the same podcast, which was really tough for me one year. And I went back and listened to it a year later, and I could understand it like so much better. And that feeling of like that. And then I went and listened to it again sometime after that. And I'm like, I got it, like, wow, so that was great. So both listening speed and vocabulary had grown. And so I was working on my language skills as I was teaching too. So that wasn't so much the thought. It was very much not knowing how to do other things.
Yeah.
And wanting to have the kids be engaged, wanting them to be interested in class and volunteering to answer and willing to do the things I was asking them to do. So I was trying to find like interesting activities, which then made it so I had to explain a lot. Like, okay, today we're going to play this game, and then you're going to be in this team and this, like, that's very long. But I did have some good materials from that first textbook. We had these videos that were live people, really cheesy videos, but they were fun to watch, because like, if you could get into the fact that it's like, oh brother, it was fun to watch. So that was a source of input. And when I started talking about those with the students in Chinese instead of in explaining things in English so much. I started using photographs, like I mean, this photograph could even be one, and pointing to things and asking questions and making statements about what they saw. So it wasn't just a vocabulary flashcard photo, it was a rich context to talk photo. So those kinds of things kind of turned the corner for me. And then I started to see my students developing natural speaking, and that was like, so they were growing more comfortable. They weren't like, I had to memorize this and now I can produce this one sentence perfectly. It was much more like, hey, I have words kicking around in my head, and it comes out quickly and more fluently than it ever had, and with less anxiety from the student, because it feels good to them. They're like, they know what to say because they've got it. So yeah, that was extremely motivating, and I wanted to keep seeing that happen. So
yeah, and I bet they were having way more fun as well, right?
Well, mostly, yeah. And I should say, one of the things that happened about the end of the first year of this kind of real intentional transition on my part, I had a very strong mindset that I needed to co-create stories with students all the time, and then we would read it. And so I was doing a very classic TPRS kind of model. For some people, if that's all that you do and it's working great, awesome. It's like, but like, I've moved from like feeling like methods are the way that I teach to what's called post method, and working out of principles from which I select which activities we do. And so one of the things I still do is co-create a lot of stories and co-create descriptions of photos and video clips and things like that. So I do a lot of things that look similar or are similar to what I learned from TPRS, but it's not always a co-created story from scratch with students. But at the time I thought, well, I had to do it because I wanted to do it right. I was so worried that I knew what I was doing before wasn't as effective. And I saw people doing things with TPRS that were, and I wanted to be like that. And so unfortunately, that meant I burned one of my classes. They were 7th graders at the time. Yeah, so I guess they were my 3rd class that had come through all levels of the program. I think that's right. And I remember there was a day in about late October where I was, every day we were going to do either co-creating a story or we were going to read that story. And I try to make it engaging. I mean, there were student actors and we did stuff with it a little bit, but I mean, we're going to do this. And I was counting on them knowing all the vocabulary from past years.
Okay.
that was a mistake. So, I was counting on, well, in 6th grade, you had this chapter that had these 20 words, even though I knew like that was hard, So they could pass quizzes and then they'd forget, So then the next year I'm treating it like, well, you should know all these words. All you have to do is just tell me if you don't understand. That's fine. Just, tell me you don't, like, no, 7th graders are not going to do that when it's every 3rd word. Like, they're lost, most of them, and frustrated and bored, and it was too much detail and too digging a hole in the ground. And one day in late October, they looked at me like this. I'm like, okay, so I knew things were wrong before that, but I sat down and I said, okay, tell me what's going on here, because we can't go on like this. And so I listened to them for 45 minutes, tell me about how much they hated stories. And I'm making fun of them a little bit, but it wasn't that they hated stories, it was that they hated what I was doing to them and expecting them to know vocabulary that they could not possibly recall. Right. And I was so, they're 7th graders, so they were like 11 to 13. And I was asking them to process things in an abstract way at such a level. We had no images, no pictures. The most concrete thing in the room was maybe a student actor. Right. But it was this big, long, drawn out thing. It was too much for them. And so teachers in Ben Slavic's professional learning community said, here, back away from stories. Here are some things that are smaller and that you can do. And actually, they were things that I had already done. But I felt like, the gold standard is co-create stories. And so I ran for that as hard as I could. And I backed off from that and I started to diversify the kinds of activities, still thinking through, I want this to be comprehension based, that they experience a lot of language they can understand well. But in a way that they're engaged with it. So they're showing responses, they're helping to determine the course of what we talk about. So it can be very student-centered. And later on, I kind of added that thought of there needs to be a purpose beyond just language study here. But there's a communication that's happening as well. So kind of now I'm getting into where I am now, thinking about what is it to teach language and what's effective.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I guess the first thing is it needs to be comprehensible, right? And that's when pictures and images and context come in, right? But then we don't even know it as adults. Like, how many times do we need to hear a specific word in order to be able to recall it in a real life conversation? Because many times, first of all, as a teacher, you might assume the students are understanding that word. And again,
and they may play along because they don't want to be embarrassed, or they don't want to act rebellious, or maybe, maybe the culture is like, I shouldn't ask questions of the teacher about something they did. Like, I should have known that kind of feel, a lot of students had that I've taught.
Yeah, adults will tell you most times, but yeah, there's a difference there. But then, even if you've listened to a specific word or phrase 20 times, I'm just making that number up, it doesn't mean you're going to be able to recall it later on. You might need number 25, or I'm just making numbers up.
Yeah, and the context in which you heard it, was there an emotional connection to it? Was there like a reason, like you needed that word before, and so you heard it and like, it clicked more. I mean, there's all these different variables going on all the time. It's really interesting. Like, and different people will be different in the same class. So, one of the things I tell adult students now is that there is no should. There is no should have known that. There's just, do you right this moment know that? And so if you're feeling lost, you need to let me know. Like, for me, it's okay if there's a little bit of a noise, like a little bit of unknown in the language. If you're feeling okay about it and you're able to continue to engage with it. So if like you lose a phrase here or there, but you're tracking with the overall message, for me, that's tolerable limits for me. But if it's not for that student, they're like, hey, they can let me know at any point in time. And if they're lost because of one word, that can happen a lot. Stop me and tell me. And I would agree, adults, when feeling safe, are a little more likely to do that. I think students in a classroom in middle school or high school maybe never totally feel as safe.
Yeah, right.
So yeah, part of the job of the teacher is really to help coach the kids on this is how this works. And I really do need to hear from you, and you really do help me when you stop me.
Right.
And because this is about communication in the classroom, not about I'm dumping information into your mind that you're supposed to get all at once. No,
Yeah.
it's we're doing this thing together. It's constructive.
Yeah, and I guess they're used to that dynamic of, the teacher just talking and spitting things out, and just they're just that sitting and listening. So it takes, but I like that attitude of no, there's no should, like that. I think that's a good one for language teaching and for life in general. But anyway.
Yeah. You're just where you are. Just take another step. Right.
Exactly. Yeah, I had another thing in mind. What was it? Because I want to get into specifics when it comes to Chinese, because it's a really interesting language because of how different it is.
Yeah, from either of our first languages, for sure. Yeah.
Spanish or Italian, French, German. But I want to ask you one more thing about the last topic, but I forgot. Oh yeah, no, I want to say that when students don't tell you that they're not understanding, and they even enter that sort of vicious circle in which they don't understand a word, they don't want to tell you, so they start trying to guess what it means. So they're thinking about it. You go on.
They're missing. Yes.
So then they lose that
so
part.
they're off on it.
So
Yeah.
Exactly.
Right, for sure.
Yeah.
I've had people even tell me that. Like, well, I knew I didn't know, but I thought maybe I could figure it out, and then I realized I couldn't. But then
you were here.
Then I was told. Like, okay, yeah.
It's like real life conversation that you're thinking ahead. You're thinking of what you're going to reply, and you're not really paying attention to what the other person's saying.
Yeah, that's the problem too.
Yeah. So yeah, I wanted to ask you about the alphabet specifically. Like, first of all, as a student yourself, how do you go about it, or how was your experience when it comes to that part?
Yeah, I'm going to turn my camera and write on a board that's over on the wall behind me. So there, I'll write the same word in Chinese. Let me think. Okay. So this is a character, and this happens to mean chicken. In Mandarin, we pronounce it ji. So there's a way to transliterate that sound, and it looks like that.
Right.
So they do use an alphabet in the pinyin system of transliterating Chinese, but there's nothing here that's like an alphabet. There's nothing in this character that tells me it sounds like that. What the character tells me is this thing is actually it's a simplified character. So I can't remember what the original looked like. It looked a little bit more like a bird, I think, over there. This part actually means something to do with your hand. I suspect it had some relationship to the sound of the word. I'm not sure. But often there's a part there that will either remind you of the general gist of the sound, something similar to the sound, and something else in there will remind you of the meaning. Often 85% of the characters are like that. So over here on this side, which I never write very beautifully, that part is a bird. And maybe you can see the bird. Here's the head up here.
Okay.
And there's kind of maybe the wing here, and sort of the front of the bird, and eyeball right there. Yeah, so that appears in many different characters for something related to some kinds of birds. So when you find out, oh, that's chicken, and then there's this part there, okay, that's going to trigger my memory. It means some kind of a bird. Oh, it means the part that maybe sounds sort of like that. Maybe. I don't know if that component has a sound that's similar, to be honest. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. Because they've been written for thousands of years, the changes in the sound system have those have changed, but sometimes the character remains the same. So it doesn't always have a relationship between the sound and the meaning of the character necessarily. But so there is some guide, but Chinese people do not read this as if this is the language. This is like when we look in a dictionary to look up English words, there's the phonetic pronunciation of the word next to the spelling of the word. This is like that pronunciation of the word. This is the real word. And so if you're not reading in characters, you're missing a lot. You're just getting sounds of Chinese, and you're not connecting to the meaning and the historic connections that the language has within itself. So I find it actually, after a point, it's easier to know characters than to try to continue to just work off of the phonetic system. So the way I learned it, I learned all this stuff together, and all that stuff that I said about, this means this, and this, like we analyzed the characters as we learned them, as the word was new, as we were trying to pick up the sound. So how many is that? Like history of the character and sound, meaning, appearance of the character, different components. So like 5 or 6 different aspects of one word at a time. That's a lot. Yeah. So what I do now is separate these 2 steps. So I work when their words are new and the learner is a beginner, I work with pinyin while they're kind of in that initial, oh, I'm hearing that word, what does that mean? So what I'd have on the board would be none of this, and I would have this. And as I say the word ji, I would go over here and point and look at the students and see that they're tracking approximately, and then continue to use that word in the context of other words that they know. Do you have chickens? Do you like chickens? Do you see any chickens? I do, because they live back behind our house. So using that while the word is becoming familiar. And then when we're ready to read, this goes away because they don't need it now. They know this, so they're connecting sound to meaning. And when I see that that's getting pretty firm for everybody, I figure, okay, now we can show what it looks like. So when we read in my classes, often at the end of class, we'll start where I'll be typing and I'll ask students for like, well, what should we start our reading to look like? And then I'll extend it and finish it after class. But let's say if this word was new, I'd want to put that in there like 10 or more times. I got that from Terry Waltz, who does a lot of training for Mandarin Chinese teachers. She suggests like 10 to 20 times to see that new word in print the first time you're reading it. And then over time, you're going to see it again. But that first time you're kind of loading in lots of opportunity to go, that's G. Oh, G looks like that. Well, so the idea is like, this is so strong. The sound and the meaning is so strong. All you're doing when you're reading is just adding, that's what it looks like. And then later on, we do the analysis of the parts of the character. Where's maybe the historical development of the character, if that's fun for students, or there's a good reason to do that, rather than doing it all at once. So it also, like a researcher who is actually one of my dissertation committee professors, thank you, Dr. Michael Everson, he talked about it being a process view of reading. So looking at it like we can work with pinyin for a while and then have them read the same text. In his case, it was like everything was pinyin for several weeks of class. And then everything switched to characters, no new words, just read the words you've already heard. And so his idea was like, if we can give them that first experience just with oral language, like a Chinese child, and then add the reading when they have developed some language ability, then that's going to be better for them than try to do it all together. Because, 5 different things about every word is very burdensome.
But I was thinking, do you think the pinyin part is a necessary stepping stone, or could you go straight to character equals chicken, or character equals and a picture of a chicken? I'm just thinking about it.
In the case of some immersion programs, I've heard some do that, like with like kindergarten and first grade kids. And I think that in China, that's the way they do it too. Let me think. In preschool, I think they just show them characters. First grade, I believe they also are just looking at characters. And then in second grade, I think, or maybe it's first grade is the transition. they start kids who are already kind of semi-literate in characters, and they see them everywhere they go. So there's constant exposure to characters. Their minds are tracking with characters in a way you and I would not so much growing up in an environment without characters around us all the time.
Right.
So in the case of like a Chinese child, I think that's where they start. And then they do add pinyin afterwards, though, because they want standard pronunciation across the country of Mandarin. So there are regional dialects that still exist, but in order to communicate across the whole country, they have a standardized language that people are all taught. So pinyin comes in for that.
Okay.
For Westerners who have an alphabet background, the problem, I think, is not so much using pinyin, but it's using pinyin over the character and showing that all the time, and trying to expect someone who's trained to read alphabet languages just ignore that.
Yeah, not gonna happen.
You're not gonna happen. So if you want me to read characters, don't show me pinyin with it.
I mean, absolutely. Yeah. Like if you have both, one, it's like watching a movie in the target language with subtitles in your own native language. Your mind's gonna go to the native language, right?
Yeah, naturally, it's where you're stronger. Yeah, and Chinese teachers, if anybody's watching, they'll say, but in second grade in China, this is what we give students. We do give them a text that has characters and pinyin, and they do fine. Again, who are those children? What is their language exposure? They are fluent in Chinese already. They have the ear for Chinese already. The language makes sense to them. They're growing vocabulary, but they know Chinese. Your non-native student who has 100 hours of class time per year, or 150 maybe, that student does not have this strong language in their mind that they have grown from their birth. And so they are a different kind of learner than a native Chinese child who's exposed to language all the time. So when the second grader, also who has seen characters from their birth, constantly surrounding them and seeing mom and dad or family or their teacher reading things aloud from signs on TV. If you watch TV in China, everything is subtitled in characters. It's to promote literacy. So kids grow up constantly seeing this. Their minds are not going, what is that? Like an alphabet trained mind kind of has a natural reaction, like to see the difference in characters is really kind of challenging at first. Right. They need more time. And so, when the second grader in China can do this and can kind of visually ignore pinyin except where they need it, well, because their mind is already keyed in on characters have meaning. And I did not have that background. And so I think the approach can differ to get to the same goal, which is reading texts that don't have this and just reading characters and reading it and connecting to the sound of standard Mandarin.
Right.
So that's my plug for Chinese reading. There we go. I love it. I love reading Chinese characters. And the reason I would delay introducing characters while the word is sounding new is so that students succeed in the reading step with less burden.
Yeah. Because I'm always obsessed with how to put it into words. Like whenever I'm not sure about something when it comes to languages, I tend to go with the natural way, right? Mm-hmm. And the way kids in China are exposed to the language is through characters, right? First of all,
mm-hmm. Mostly.
So I'm thinking that pinyin, it's on one side. Like an attempt from us Westerner adults to learn to sort of hack the process in a way, or like you said, they do it in China, so they have a standardized accent throughout the whole country. But it has nothing to do with the actual language acquisition of the language, because that happened before, right?
Yeah, before pinyin existed, people did learn to read in China. But I would say literacy was not very prevalent in China until the modern, like maybe the last 50 years.
Okay.
When pinyin was used to promote Mandarin, when characters were simplified in China, Taiwan and Singapore and other places where Chinese language is prevalent, sometimes have differences. In Taiwan now, they are using pinyin more and more because it's a very systematic way to represent the sound of Mandarin. So it developed by Chinese people. In fact, the person who created Pinyin for the Chinese government, I think he died at age 103 or something like that, like just a few years ago. And I was very honored, when he passed, because he'd done things that changed the way that the language is taught. So the goal, I think, was partly so there was mutual understandability, so everybody could speak in the same way. And then I think for Westerners, you're right, it feels like this great hack, like, oh, I got something that I can tell what that sound is. I can write the sound in a way that represents it and make that connection. Yeah, there's a book publisher. It's Jared Turner is the name of the man who's one of the people behind it. Mandarin Companion. Jared wrote a blog post years ago that was called something like The Crippling Crutch. And it's this situation. If you have that always showing, you're not, as an alphabet language trained mind, you're going to have a real hard time here.
Yeah.
But do you need to know how to read Chinese characters to be fluent in Mandarin? No, but I think you're missing things. I think you're missing a lot. I think you're missing the connections between words, because you can't tell by sound. Like in English, sometimes you can tell by sound that the words are related, like phonology and telephone, and what else do we have that has phone? But those things all relate to the word sound. In Chinese, you're not so likely going to hear a part that is telling you about relationships of meaning across different words. You're going to see it in the characters, and so that it's wonderful.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just thinking about different ideas. So back to the chicken example. So what if you're like right away when you start in the story, you're gonna use a chicken, you use the character right away equals chicken, or even better, a picture of a chicken, right? Next to it.
Okay.
Or if you're using a verb, just a picture of yourself. If you're talking about eating, just, someone eating or you gesturing it out. Is that,
what would it do?
Could you do that without the Pinyin part, directly with characters, and obviously helping them a lot with images and context and?
You might. Here's another reason why Pinyin is an advantage. Most typing systems rely on Pinyin as the input method. There is a way to do it based on handwritten strokes that are within the character, but that is harder to learn, in my opinion, if you don't have a character language background. Like people in Japan already know a lot of the same characters, as I mentioned before. So they may be okay with that. Seeing that right away may be better, perhaps, for them. I'm not sure. I haven't had fluent speakers of Japanese in my classes. I have had fluent speakers of Korean in classes. Korean is not a character language, but in South Korea, they do teach a lot about characters, and people's names can be written in characters pretty much. And so students from Korea who have been in my classes or have a heritage Korean language sometimes are more primed to see those characters sooner, even though their language isn't written in characters, just because they've learned them a lot. And so maybe for them, I would do it. I do when I was teaching upper levels, like fourth year AP classes, I would just do that. I would just show new words in characters right away and say the word. Sometimes I would say, how, in Chinese, I'd ask them, how do you think you'd spell that? Listen. And as we would double check that they could spell it, because I wanted them to be able to type the word later. And by then they're really pretty good. They've figured out that, and by figured out, I mean, they've kind of not had to really work too hard at figuring out how to spell things in Pinyin, because they've had years of exposure by then. Okay. And so they've connected, okay, that J sound is going to sound like, So in their case, yeah, I do. And I think if it's a heritage Chinese learner too, show them the characters right away for words that they already know how they sound. As long as Pinyin is really useful because of that typing thing. To be able to look up words in a dictionary or something, that's, it helps make you more independent and productive to have the ability to use Pinyin.
Okay, so
So it's, yeah, it's complicated.
yeah, I can see that. So someone from, I don't know, Kansas who wants to learn Chinese starting from scratch, you wouldn't go with characters right away.
Not in the first couple hours. And then I would have a reading text that was based on that couple of hours where they were seeing pinyin, hearing meaning. And we did something with, I often end up starting with pictures, or sometimes I hold like a stuffed animal and talk about who has dogs, who has cats. Do you have dogs? Is your dog big? Is your dog small?
Right.
Whatever. So we find out something about each other, or something that they make it up about themselves, about dogs or cats. And then the text that they're going to read, maybe 2 or 3 hours, depending on what I see their progress to be. Like if they're seeming like really quick, easy answers to questions, some people are starting to say the new words as we're talking, without seeming to struggle much. Then I'm thinking, okay, those words are starting to really be familiar enough to them. They're putting them into that matrix in their minds of language. And so they're probably ready to read them. And then I would show them in character text.
Mm-hmm.
So it would be about somebody has a dog who's a big dog. He doesn't have a little dog. He has a big dog. And it would have those new characters in there a whole lot of times.
Mm.
So it's not a long delay in my case. I would say it's generally 2 or 3 hours. Sometimes though, after I get started with that, after that first time reading, I'm going to give reading after each class just because I see them once a week. And so if you don't continue to have some more opportunity to read, I think it's going to fade.
Right.
That's one of the things I think about Chinese, maybe more than a phonetically written language. I think it just takes more time. People like to say difficult for that situation. I would say it just means different. It means different things. The Chinese is beautiful in that the verbs are extremely straightforward. There is no conjugation. There is no verb agreement. There is no tense. So all of those things that make, from what I understand, Spanish considered very hard, those don't exist in Chinese. So where a language has more time to get to some part of it, there is also some area of that language that is going to take you less time to get there. And it's the distance between your first language or the languages you know and Chinese that makes it more challenging. Like I mentioned, I taught Korean kids in high school, a couple of them particularly I'm thinking of. They read very quickly and reliably in characters because of that past exposure to Chinese script. In the case of the one girl in Korean schools, I think they taught something along those lines. She showed me stuff that she had worked on, and before she even took a Chinese class. So the exposure helped her a lot. And then the fact that there are cognates between Korean and Chinese. A lot of words were borrowed in from Chinese and became part of Korean. And so, big advantages there. So it wasn't that hard for her.
Right. Yeah, the language is not harder itself. It's just there are a lot of factors involved, like you said.
Exactly.
And if I'm learning Italian as a native Spanish speaker, I'm gonna be able to access comprehensible resources on my own way quicker than I am with.
Right.
So
definitely. I think that's the challenge with Chinese. It's hard to get to the point of being independent quickly. Right. And so a lot of people, like, they are doing massive memorization of characters on a little app or something on their phone, because they're that type of person. If you're learning Chinese independently, I think, wow, that's tough. I would say take a class until you can get something more. Like I've been producing reading videos and then little short videos where I'm outside. Like I live in the countryside. I really do have chickens. And so when I think of it, or it seems like something interesting is going on, I'll take a little video clip that's like 2 minutes or 4 minutes long, something short, and I'll narrate it in simple Chinese. occasionally throw in an English word to clarify the meaning somewhere. I'm trying to point at things on the camera and stuff like that. And then they build up over time. So those are like my little listening resource videos. And then I have reading resource videos, things that we've created for the classes I teach that, again, kind of build. So week to week, there's another video where there's a lot of the same words that came up in previous ones and 2-3 new ones in this video. So those are read along videos on the channel that I have, and it's in my name. So Diane Neubauer.
I'll leave the link
oh yeah
down below.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so the idea to get through that, I think that's that bottleneck part of learning Chinese, is that part where characters are all new. A lot of programs will tend to load it on the character at that, or on the student at that point, make them memorize a lot, and trying to work around other ways to do it. I mean, they do exist. There are better ways to do it than grunt through 100 characters a week or whatever.
Because
you can,
how many how many characters are there?
I have heard varying accounts of this. To be able to like to any word altogether, I think I've heard 30,000, which is far fewer than English, by the way. I think English has 120,000 words, something, but most people don't use 30,000 characters. Like, I think I've heard, like, I think at the end of middle school or junior high school, I think they expect students to read 1,500 words. And then by the end of high school, I think it's 3,100. Don't quote me. That's for Chinese children. So they're thinking, like, to graduate from high school, 3,000 plus words. I think I have that number right. I may not. It's not 30,000 though. So if there's a lot of obscure ones, and some have fallen out of use. Some have been created by the internet. Here, this one's fun, since I have this up here. When I tell you that means awkward, embarrassed, really feeling uncomfortable, can you tell why?
Emoji.
It was made, yeah. It's like, here's your eyes and the head, and then the mouth going, So this was a character, I think, that existed before that didn't mean that. And then somebody found this ancient character and brought it in, and it became this really hot word on the internet. So it's pronounced Zhong. So if somebody's like feeling Zhong, it's like, you're like, I have no idea what to do. This is so awkward. This is so terrible. So they're creating new characters too.
Yeah. I mean, what I had in mind is there's so many characters that if you try to memorize them, it's just crazy. Like, it's one thing to be able to read 1,500 characters or 3,500, but that doesn't mean you need to memorize them. It just sounds
right. Yes, and I think it's unfortunate that often we like, oh, well, you need to be able to do this thing as the goal, and so the assumption then is, well, that means I need to grunt work, to, like, well, no, there are many ways to attempt to reach this goal, and some are more pleasant and some are more successful than others. So
absolutely. And I always think the natural ways, because I always talk about the same thing. Like, when we're kids, like, we're not born with a specific chip or whatever you want to call it to learn Chinese or English, Spanish, or whatever the language, right? It's like we all have the ability to learn any language. It's just that I grew up in Spain, so I was exposed to Spanish. You grew up in America, so you were, so we all have the ability to learn Chinese if we want to. Because I'm always thinking, because now I'm learning Russian now, and I know I know it's different. So, like, Chinese is like a different animal, because Russian, you can figure things out when it comes to the characters. I mean, because it's a different alphabet.
Yeah, it's phonetically written.
Yeah.
Approximately. I don't know how irregular.
Some words are some words are the same. Some others, you can figure it out. But I remember learning to read in Russian by watching videos of, so I started watching videos of Russian teachers who use comprehensible input, right? And I remember, like, I watched a video from a friend of mine, Ina, that I had on the podcast as well. And she had a map of Europe, right? And all the country names were in Cyrillic alphabet, in Russian. So as she was playing, I don't remember what the video was about, but I noticed the first word in Finland and in France was sort of a globe with the stick. So I was like,
yeah. So you're like,
that's F.
Yeah.
So yeah. It's like, in a natural way, my brain picked it up without me having to consciously learn it or memorize it. You know what I mean? So that's why what I'm trying to figure out with Chinese, with, again, it's a completely different animal, because, you know.
Yeah, but I think that what you're getting there is kind of similar, in the sense that you're making a connection to the sound of words, you know, to how they look.
Right.
And so that, yeah, that's the process of reading, is connecting up to sounds that mean something, and now they're represented in a certain way. So yeah.
Yes, that's why.
Yeah, this is one of my big research interests. So want to do stuff on how do people learn to read Chinese as a second language, but new scripts in general. Like, how can we do that? How does it happen? And
that's why
incredible.
I tend to lean into the natural way as much as I can. You know, if kids do it this way in that specific language, let's try to replicate that, right? Or at least I tend to think that's the better way.
Yeah, sometimes though, like I mentioned, like the common sense way to teach Chinese children to read, I think should be different than a non-native, non-character language background learner.
You're biased by the
yeah. So there's natural and there's natural. Like,
yeah, I understand.
Like, I guess to my thinking, it's like, I want to work with the way that functions socially for us in the classroom. Like, can we pull it off together? And does it align with how minds seem to work? And what sources of input there are. So like, I'm thinking of on 3 levels of how languages are acquired when we're talking about classroom language acquisition, especially. And so, like, thinking of those factors, like, how can I do this in a way that works with teachers and students in the classroom setting? How can I work in a way that aligns with what we know about the mind and how it treats language and how it builds language? And then how does it align with what we know about how to provide sources of language input that are going to be more high leveraged for developing language ability? And so it's not having 50 words that are new in a short paragraph. It's having 3 and seeing them 10 times, or, you know, like that, like thinking through those kinds of issues.
Yeah, and focus. I mean, once again, because of how different the language you teach is, from Spanish, English, you need to do a lot more research on those things. But in general,
I think
go ahead.
Oh, I was thinking, yeah, I think you're right. There's because there are more distances and there are more differences to overcome to developing fluency. Yeah, you have to know how to deal with those different steps. With, like, I've learned some Spanish in classes, and then also just because I have friends who are Spanish teachers or Spanish speakers on the internet, they post all the time. And so I often end up reading some Spanish and kind of getting some of it at least. And I'm sure my Spanish is growing from this without my really trying that hard. But it's because I see the letters, I've heard it at least a little bit from classes. I can guess how that's going to sound pretty close. I mean, yeah. So
yeah,
you can't do that with these if you're not kind of keyed in on the system already. And so actually I've even heard people talk about this as like the culture that develops then around how languages are taught or how they're learned or learning in general kind of can relate to this. Like in Chinese, you kind of need some help to understand it. So the transmission, the teacher role becomes really culturally important in a way that I don't know that it is in an English language environment, even a more traditional English language environment where teachers were more respected than they are in the US right now.
Right.
Unfortunately.
When it comes to Chinese, you rely more on the teacher. You depend on it.
I think at first, at least.
Yep.
Yeah. And there are ways to work around that, but somebody has to have that beginner in mind, I think, so if you're doing resources on your own, they're thinking of what you need as a beginner, right, and scaling it for you, I think. Otherwise, I think it's either demotivating because it's so much all at once. And then the language gets the bad reputation of being too hard to learn. Like, well, maybe if we do it in a different way. Yeah. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, just you have so many more things to worry about, because when it comes to my native language, what I'm always doing is I'm trying to think of idea. I'm always thinking about the story itself, whether that's a story or a game. So I'm thinking about ideas in which my students or people watching my videos can get exposed to the language in a comprehensible way, but they don't feel like they're learning the language. And what I mean is, so
yeah, they're thinking about something else through the language. Yeah,
and that's easier to do with Spanish, because I can get away with, even if you're a beginner, we can play an escape room game. By the way,
yeah,
that's a good one, because there are a lot of eggs and
very cool. Mm-hmm.
Or
yeah, I see things that my Spanish colleagues could do, and just like, you can do that in level 1. That sounds like level 3,
right?
because yeah, you can borrow in from cognates, and from what you write on the board is going to connect pretty quickly to sounds that they can recognize, and yeah, they're closer languages. There's more of a relationship. So yeah, use it. Definitely use it.
All right. And how about your languages right now? Are you looking to learn any language? Working on some?
Somewhat. I continue to work with my Chinese. I've been reading, Jane Austen in translation lately. Jane Austen books published in Chinese. I've read some sci-fi in Chinese. So that's, I'm reading things designed for native learners. So that's fun. Sometimes I watch something, a video or a TV show on YouTube, but somehow it's reading books for me in Chinese. It's more fun. And then I've taken some ASL classes, so American Sign Language. ASL, I have to think about it. It's been a little bit, but that's great because a signed language feels brand new. Although signed languages I felt like there were some things in common with the visualness of characters. Like there was some of the same logic behind them. So yeah, but they're very unique too. The way that nuances are expressed in sign language can't be done in sound exactly. So there's some cool stuff from that. French, and I hope to visit Agen, France again, and get to be surrounded by French again. Spanish a bit, in part because I want to be a teacher educator, and so many teachers in the US teach Spanish. It just makes sense. I need to understand their language some. I haven't explored German, Arabic, Russian, Greek, Hebrew much. I mean, just to kind of like, okay, I know about them a little bit. Korean and Japanese. I studied it for 2 years, but it would be a relearning process almost completely there. Yeah, but I love languages. Oh, Thai. I've been learning some Thai too. I was in Thailand as an exchange student when I was 16. And from that time, those are sticky things. Those daily life words with your host family lasted for a long time now. Right. And I can still draw on that. I've been back to Thailand a few times and have done a little bit with learning Thai. So that's super fun.
A lot of context and emotion from that experience, right?
Yeah. Cool. Yeah. So and I have deep fondness for the people and the language developed too. So it's motivating to keep going with that.
Awesome. So when you're learning a language now, other than Chinese, that you said you're focusing on books, By the way, you're reading Jane Austen in Chinese. You mean that means your level is quite high, yeah. But when you're starting out with a language or as a beginner, what resources do you use? Like, do you go to classes? Like that's like the first thing you do, or
When possible, yeah, or at least as a supplement. I would say, like, to get started, a class with a really good teacher would be ideal, partly because they can kind of steer you so that some of the easy pitfalls won't happen to you if you do it on your own.
right.
You know, Chinese is big for that, but I think any language is like that. Like, you're making an initial boost of a connection to that language that makes it more appealing to know where to go next with things that you can do on your own.
Yeah.
So I prefer that. Like, I've done some video learning of ASL, but the classes I took, kind of being in a whole language environment that's real, live, interactive, it really helps.
Yeah.
It really helps.
Yeah, and again, it also depends on the language, right? If you were to start with Arabic, obviously you're
I would want a teacher for Arabic for sure.
more likely to need classes than Spanish, for instance, you know.
Yeah. With Spanish and with French, I feel like I can pick up an easy reader. Like, I have some on the shelf actually, and I can use those beginning level books now. Well, my French is a little more than just beginning. I think I made me read year 2 level. I'm not sure. When I try to speak French, though, it comes out mixed with Mandarin. So that's pretty fun. Somebody special has to be there to understand what I'm trying to say. So yeah, the French is interesting, but and I don't feel like I speak Spanish at all, except a word here or there, but I can understand quite a bit.
Right. So you can watch cartoons or things of that nature. Yeah.
I would get tired from that because I can't understand all that much that well, but some, yeah.
Simple things, yeah. But
yeah.
It's funny what you said about Chinese, because I don't know what happens here in our brain, but that's happened to me several times. That I remember the first time I went to Ajan when we met in 2016.
Mm-hmm.
I learned French as a kid. I was exposed to French, but I didn't really acquire the language. So back in 2016, I couldn't speak the language at all. And I remember before the conference, I went to my parents have friends in Bordeaux, like really close to Agen. So I went to their apartment the night before the conference. So I stayed there overnight. And I remember with the grandma, she would speak French to me, and I could understand pretty much
enough to get something.
What she was talking about. But when I was about to reply, Polish came to mind, because
interesting. Yeah.
So I was tak, which is yes. Not
Isn't
even,
it funny, like what your brain does?
Yeah.
Wild. Yeah. Yes. Well, that was 2016. We were both in Sabrina Janzik's French class. Exactly. I forgot that was where we met.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. So and I was just thinking about it, that speaks volumes about the craziness of trying to force output from day one. I was just thinking about
Yeah. It's doing something very different for the learner, I think. You know, when there's survival situations where you need to be able to use, like, you need to verbalize language just to survive in that environment.
Yeah.
I get that. But in general, if you can delay, you know, and make it low key and speak when you feel like it, and start simple, and
it's just not how the brain works. So it's just a sort of an attempt to hack the process, like they always say. But other than, you know, my appendix is about to explode, what emergency situation you're gonna be in? I'm just kidding, but
well, I was thinking actually of a Korean woman I met in Southwest China in a kind of a little tourist town. I was so impressed with her Chinese, and I told her, and she said, well, I had to. Nobody here speaks Korean, you know. And so like to the way she put it was, for me to be able to eat, I had to know what to say.
Yeah.
And so she, but of course she was also surrounded by language, so she was also getting enough comprehensible input from that situation. So it wasn't like she was just, oh, I'll look it up, now I'll say it, and then that's no, she was being surrounded by language too.
Yeah,
but she had the necessity to make progress. Right. So
yeah, the process was working already.
Yeah.
Cool. So that's, that, I don't know if you had any other idea in mind that we didn't talk about, or
I think
that's pretty much it.
Yeah. Long tangents would be probably the result, but thinking of like, how does research then relate to these kinds of things, experiences of learners in classrooms or on their own trying to learn languages. To me, that's really interesting stuff. So those, just to put a plug, that's another discussion for some other time, maybe.
Yeah, we'll do part 2, sort of a cliffhanger here, as I'm just kidding. As you continue to work on your research and you learn new things about, because I think it's going to be interesting for a lot of people who wanted to learn Chinese or Japanese or just like a completely different language to their own native language.
Yeah,
felt like it was going to take them a long time and it was going to be a hard process. So I think that's going to help them, because you did it, other people do it all the time, and
it does take more time. Like what you just said about Spanish, you can do an escape room game with a beginning learner. If you did that in Chinese, you wouldn't understand very much of what's going on, so I mean, we could do a lot. I guess one of the things that's an advantage is only a few words are really, really frequently used. If you know 50 to 100 words, there's a lot actually you can do if those 50 to 100 words are really frequently used and have a broad meaning. And so, if you can get some of those first, you're going to feel the progress and feel the access to the rest of the language, I think, pretty quickly, even in a language like Chinese, if you're from a European language background.
Yeah, but then I just remember again, like obviously you have to get more creative probably, but I remember your mafia game in Chinese in Dijon, that
yes,
you were dealing with complete beginners, and I remember
super simplified it.
Of course, but so you need to get more creative, because you cannot get away with things that I can with Spanish, like you said. But I think there's a way to do it and to make it fun and comprehensible at the same time. So even though it's going to take you longer, you're still going to enjoy the process, which is
right.
Absolutely,
it can be a meaningful, engaging process from day one through.
That's key to me, because if that's not happening, you're gonna end up giving up sooner or later. If you're not enjoying the process, and we're talking languages here, but pretty much anything in life. Well, that's what I think.
Yeah.
All right, Diane. So
cool. Well, fun talking with you about these things.
Yeah, same here, absolutely. And again, different background today, like different language, different alphabet. So that's going to be useful for people, I think.
Good.
So thank you again, Diane. And
thank you.
Yeah, we'll talk about that part too sometime in the future.
Okay.
When you have new discoveries and ideas.
Okay.
All right. So bye-bye, Diane.
Great. Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you again.